Questions of much graver and universal interest occupy our minds today.
Hello, my name is Lieutenant Eric Schein. I'm a graduate of the United States Merchant Marine Academy at Kings Point. I am a naval officer and a federal maritime officer serving in the United States Merchant Marine. My time in service as a federal maritime officer serving in the United States Merchant Marine and maritime industry and shipyards and more counts for my naval commission that I receive when I come out of Kings Point. I receive a naval commission so that in times of war or national emergency, my naval commission can be activated, and if I am either on board a vessel or in a shipyard, I can act as a liaison and communicate with the Department of Navy in a time of not only war, but also natural disaster or some form of catastrophe. And what has happened is the U.S. Coast Guard, and that's what I'm here to talk to you about today, the U.S. Coast Guard has seized upon authority to adjudicate matters for the United States Merchant Marine, which is supposed to be heard in the federal judiciary, regarding our shipping articles or federal contracts that we work on as valid federal officers, and even in situations like my own where I'm also a naval officer. And instead the Coast Guard, that is a police maritime law enforcement agency that is now declaring itself to be a branch of military, a special branch of military, has actually gone as far as to violate the separation of powers doctrine that formed the three branches of government here in the United States. Initially, Article 1, which is the legislature or Congress, Article 2, which is the executive branch or the president and all other federal officers in the executive branch, including the military, and then Article 3, which is our judiciary. I was actually in civil court in federal district court, and I had underlying whistleblower grievances involving the shipping companies and the maritime industry when the Coast Guard filed prosecutorial and retaliatory countercomplaint against me, brought me before and into a military tribunal, and because of my experience and training in the Uniform Code of Military Justice, which is military law that we get trained on at the Academy by Naval Sciences, which is a branch or department or sector in the United States Navy, not the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard has nothing to do with our education. They come on board the Academy at graduation just to test us for our professional engineering license, whether it be as a mate, eventually work your way up to being a captain, or as an engineer and work your way eventually up to being a chief engineer on board an American flag vessel, or working in shipyards, and or going into active service in any branch of service, including the United States Navy. And what has happened though is the Coast Guard is trying to expand its power, expand its venue and jurisdiction, to expand its authority under the executive branch to carry on military tribunals of federal maritime officers, and it gets into a complex program of federal racketeering or federal contract racketeering, to where agencies and departments and federal employers like shipping companies and even unions or federal officers associations, many of them are known as, one is Marine Engineers Beneficial Association. It's been around since the 1870s. The American Maritime Officers Organization, which used to be a part of it, and many others, master mates and pilots and more. They all represent federal maritime officers under the American flag, and what has happened is our industry and our fleet, our federal fleet, and our American flag officers have been under attack, not just from commercial sector here in the United States, the maritime industry and the employers, but in fact from forces that are emanating from outside our country and predominantly from Europe and even England, to the point now where 97% of our cargo is now carried on foreign flag vessels. And this goes to many of the individuals who are involved are similar to the robber barons or the railroad barons that we had from the late 1800s. You have to remember that we had shipping well before we had railroads. And these very same individuals who carried on the same practices in the railroads in doing things like getting Congress to pass laws and actually import human beings from China to build the railroads here in the United States. They're the very same kind of people who are doing the same thing now, not to extend the Constitution and Bill of Rights and rule of law to other countries and other nations and other people, but to subject them and use them as indentured servants or slaves here in our own country and abroad. And they are doing anything and everything to attack people such as myself who are trying to bring up different types of corruptions, especially involving billions of dollars in the United States Merchant Marine. The program that they're using, which is the administrative law system for the Coast Guard, was intended for its own personnel only, for Coast Guard, because they are considered civil service. The Administrative Procedure Act was intended for its own internal remedial administrative processes that were to protect the record, find out what the problem was, try to correct it administratively, and this did not mean to injure someone's life, liberty, or property, or take it, or seize upon it, and to do things in a very timely fashion before, or in fact to limit the need to go into the independent judiciary. And what is happening now is, rather than carrying on these administrative remedial programs in a proper fashion and protecting people's civil rights, their life, their liberty, their property, their right to work, and more, especially as federal officers and guardians of the Constitution, these fascists, these corporatists, these industrialists, these internationalists are coming after American flag officers here in the United States, trying to take down the country intentionally. And if you look at some of the things that are going on, and then there's a couple books that I always point to. Philip Bobbitt in The Shield of Achilles is one, and I recommend that people pick this up and look into it. I'll see if I can get time to read a couple excerpts in here. But in fact I will, because it goes to the whole issue of what's going on. He talks about the market state and basically the conversion of the United States and our constitutional order into rather than having a nation state, to where we have a market state. And this market state is intended to be the North American Union, which is the merger of Canada, the United States, and Mexico into one superstate. And the reason for this, if you think about it, just one small example of what's going on, let alone constitutional rule of law rather than the rule of men, which is a feudal type system. DOD, which is Department of Defense, owns 66 million acres worldwide. It's not just the land, the 66 million acres, or the timber, or the water that sits on that land, or the little critters that run around on it, that is almost invaluable, worth hundreds of trillions of dollars. It's the gold, the uranium, the coal, the oil, and more that sits underneath that land, that if there is no more United States in name, and we carry on a change in title and move from a nation state into a continental state, or a super state in the merger of Canada, the United States, and Mexico, then whoever turns off the lights to the Republic, just like what happened in the former Soviet Union, gets to determine where all that wealth goes. And just like in the former Soviet Union, they are already selling all of these enormous public trusts and even private trusts, because a corporation is a public trust. That's why we have the stock market and more. And you've seen what's going on with Bear Stearns, but I want to read, because this is being planned. This is not happening by happenstance or chance. This is all being orchestrated from behind the scenes, and it is the largest movement. A Great Depression and a war, especially a world war, is the means or the contrivance to move as much wealth from 95% of the people into the hands of 1% to 5% of the people, and do as much of that overnight as possible. And when that happens, we are in dire straits, because the world economy is owned by some self-appointed royal families, and we're back to the very type system that we've been fighting against for not just hundreds of years, but thousands of years. And I want to read this. It's called The Historic Consequences of the Long War. And this comes from Philip Bobbitt's book, The Shield of Achilles. And you have to really look at where this individual is educated. He's also educated in London as well. The thesis is the market state is superseding the nation state as a consequence of the end of the Long War. The end of the Long War has been quickly followed by the emergence of a new constitutional order. This new form, and I must real quick say that the Long War is what started in 1914 with World War I and what ended in 1990, and this is by their own definition, with the fall of the wall in Berlin and the reunification of Germany. And there's a lot of not only English, but Austrian, Bavarian, and German influence in what is going on right now here in the United States. The end of the Long War has been quickly followed by the emergence of a new constitutional order. This new form is the market state, whereas the nation state, with its mass free public education, universal franchise, which included our right to get into courts, our library system, all things that were part of the Commonwealth or public trust that were held in trust for all of us to grow into perpetuity, are all being privatized and sold to their friends. And Social Security policies promise to guarantee the welfare of the nation. The market state promises instead to maximize the opportunity of the people and thus tends to privatize many state activities. And you'll love this. This is the most critical, and it should shock you in what they're saying here, because it's very clear. And to make voting and representative government less influential and more responsive to the market. That means rather than having the market and the marketplace and what we buy and sell come under laws, rules, and regulations and towards what we want as a people and what our representative government puts out there as laws, all of that, including voting and our representative government, will instead be responsive to the market. And that is fascism. That is corporatism. Even Mussolini himself said that it should not be called fascism, it should be called corporatism. The United States, as a principal innovator in the development of the market state, must fashion its strategic policies with this fundamental constitutional change in mind. And the reason I bring that up is it goes to my own situation, where the Coast Guard, under Admiral Loy, Admiral Collins, Admiral Cray, or Crea, it's C-R-E-A, she's a vice admiral. She will probably be taking over from Admiral Allen soon. She's involved in as much of this as any of them. They are and have been not only moving women out of command positions, they've done this to several administrative law judge personnel, Massey and Denson, but they are using the system, the Coast Guard, to create regulations, and not necessarily through Congress. Some of this is coming directly from the Coast Guard itself, seizing upon authority, like in my own case. They have brought charges against me, even though I'm not in the Coast Guard, do not serve in the Coast Guard, have never served in the Coast Guard, have never been paid by the Coast Guard. I went to a separate and distinct Federal Service Academy that is a sister academy or parent academy to the Coast Guard, and the Coast Guard is trying to seize control over all federal maritime officers and any disputes that may arise on board as to feeding programs, as to safety, as to pay, or any other rights that are included in our shipping articles that were enacted in 1791. And it has become clear to me through the process that I've been trapped within for the last 5 years under the charges brought against me by the Coast Guard. And the charges against me are not for a violation of law or rule or regulation, but they've actually charged me with, quote unquote, being depressed. This relates back to, there's issues of leave that I had asked for involving the sickness and then death of my father. There's a whole gambit of other issues where we are to have a grievance and arbitration process, a system of redress that's to be paid for by the industry, and instead the Coast Guard is using its federal funds and personnel to create this system under its authority as a branch of military, so that rather than having a civilian form of redress for civilian mariners in a time of peace or in a time that is not a declared war by Congress, where we have a war going on in Afghanistan and in Iraq that has all been started through a authorization to use force, not a proper declaration of war. We have not used a proper declaration of war since probably World War II. The use of authorization of force is very limited. They are using these quote-unquote warlike conditions to carry on activities like they are with me, to seize upon venue and jurisdiction. Even I was the first case that the Coast Guard brought against a civilian federal maritime officer, and I happen to be a naval officer as well, And that's why I understand fully what is going on and feel it is my constitutional duty as a citizen and as a soldier, as an officer, to report upon to you, the citizenry, of what is going on in the upper echelon with people like Admiral Allen and others who are trying to militarize everything and do so under admiralty, which is constitutional in nature, so that they can treat us all as subjects rather than citizens with rights or entitlements under the law, and that we instead have privileges, just like in ancient Europe, in old world Europe, where we are in a feudal system to where they get to decide what our rights are rather than being able to go into court and defend your own rights. And they are blockading. I've been in, because of what's going on with the Coast Guard, I was in federal district court in LA, Los Angeles. The Coast Guard brought charges against me in the middle of that civil court proceeding, pulled me out into a military tribunal to step upon those civil complaints, prevent my ability to prosecute those civil complaints and or appeals, took over control of my counsel in those proceedings, forced counsel upon me to where the pre-existing defendants from federal district court, from the Article 3 proceedings, civil court, became my counsel in the military tribunal. I had the Federal Officers Association and the shipping companies who had been sued in civil court take over and control my counsel within the Coast Guard military tribunals. And what's scary about this is they're not prosecuting me as a Coast Guard officer or Coast Guard personnel, because I've never been in the Coast Guard. They're not prosecuting me as a naval officer, which I am and have been, or a federal maritime officer. They are alleging that I am a civilian, so the Coast Guard can somehow, much like the Gestapo from Nazi Germany, can prosecute civilians here in the United States now, pull them out of civil court, hold them indefinitely like they have done to me for the last 5 years, steal records, falsify records, put a bolo out on an individual, be on the lookout or wanted or warning poster, allow the same individual who was the citing officer like a police officer become the prosecutor in the case, take over the case. He had brought charges, this individual, a Lieutenant Triboulet, had brought charges against me in March 6, 2003, 5 days after Coast Guard moved into Homeland Security, and charged me with, quote unquote, being depressed, which is not a valid charge. It's not a violation of law, rule, or regulation. That's like saying you showed up to work sick one day and then prosecuting you for that. It is not a valid violation of pollution laws or anything else. And what's worse is this branch of military that is not supposed to be a branch of military is now taking over pollution laws, discharge laws, environmental laws, energy policy, including liquefied natural gas carriers that are going to be popping up all throughout the United States, and nuclear power facilities as well, because most nuclear generating facilities, or if not all, are built on the water, usually the ocean, because they use the ocean as a cooling medium for the reactors. And what has happened is now the energy policy under Dick Cheney and under this president is to militarize everything, bring it under military authority, under admiralty, which is constitutional in nature, and dances between what is military and what is civilian. And they are using admiralty not just only in my own situation, but they intend to extend and expand this entire program over all civilians here in the United States. And people need to get involved, learn about what is going on, figure out what is going on. You can go online and see a lot of the information about my own situation. The Coast Guard itself is using CG Blog and a bunch of other blogs to try to attack me personally and the information that I'm getting out, and going back to try to defend the position that they are supposed to be a branch of military when they are not. The Beverly Hills Police Department has uniforms, and they also have guns. And a lot of police departments have a lot of guns, and they have combat vehicles, SWAT teams, automatic rifles, and more. And at some point, they're not a branch of military. They're not intended to be a branch of military. They are a police law enforcement agency. But you can also see how these police law enforcement agencies are becoming much more militant and much better armed to go after the citizenry and control the citizenry, because people are starting to figure out that what is going on is not only unconstitutional, but when you start to look at things like the first U.S. Coast Guard Commandant, his name is Berthoff, he was court-martialed out of the Naval Academy. That should be a red flag to a lot of people. He went into the Revenue Cutter Marine, and he jumped over 22 other officers of higher rank and longer length of service, to become the first U.S. Coast Guard Commandant in the middle of war, who was also, get this, he was knighted by the King of England. And when you start to look at these things in the larger scope and what our founding fathers felt about accepting titles of nobility from a foreign power, especially England, you would see them rolling over in their grave, literally. The other individuals who have been knighted by the Queen, and much of this and what is going on, not only attacks upon our Merchant Marine, but attacks upon myself by people like Admiral Allen, is coming from England, or I should say from Austria, Bavaria, Germany, through England, using England as a thoroughfare. Ronald Reagan was knighted by the Queen of England. George Herbert Walker Bush was knighted by the Queen of England, and it is a hereditary title that is passed on to the son. Our current president was knighted by the Queen of England. Kissinger, Henry Kissinger, was knighted by the Queen of England. Giuliani, Rudy Giuliani, former mayor and was presidential candidate, was also knighted by the Queen of England. Alan Greenspan, and you've seen what's happened to our economy and the dollar, and they're trying to blame a lot of this on Bernanke when it's, Greenspan is the problem. Greenspan was also knighted by the Queen of England. And when you think about this and you start to look at what else is going on in our country, not only the attacks upon myself, where I'm being prosecuted in a military tribunal as an alleged civilian, I'm being denied counsel. They've already determined somehow that I am quote-unquote mentally incompetent. I was forced to appeal this myself, have it overturned, even though I was determined to be mentally incompetent, which is kind of laughable. It was sent back to a hearing. The judge who was sitting on the case recused himself. They turned it over to a new judge, this guy, Walter J. Brzezinski. He's a lieutenant commander in the Coast Guard who is the judge on these proceedings. They have a judge advocate general officer from the Coast Guard, a Lieutenant Commander Triboulet, who is actually acting as the prosecutor, as a JAG officer, prosecuting me in a military tribunal of the Coast Guard, and they are saying that I am a civilian. And trust me, from living through these proceedings, they are Napoleonic in nature. They are under military law where you are presumed guilty, and these individuals, and I would say, I would use other terms, these individuals will lie, cheat, and steal to win. They have a somewhat like a 97 or 98% conviction rate. They use forced settlement agreements to get people to accept venue and jurisdiction under threats and coercion, and not ensuring that these individuals have proper counsel. In these proceedings, they are supposed to have proper counsel as paid for by the United States under federal contracts, and the federal contractors like the shipping companies and like the Federal Officers Association are taking the money that they are paid to provide legal counsel and legal aid to these federal maritime officers like myself and others, and taking it and putting it in their pocket. And that is just a small piece of what is going on. And to cover all that up, the billions that have been stolen and the billions that continue to be stolen, they intend to change to a market state or carry on a change in state or a change in title of the United States. They are carrying on treason. I don't know a better or more accurate way to say it and to be more specific. And people need to learn and understand what is going on, because very soon everything that you thought that you knew about our country will change forever. And they are moving quickly, and the only way that this can be confronted is to become better informed and start to understand what is going on behind the scenes, where this president, he's intended to be not only the last president, but he may never leave office until the United States is taken down. And these attacks are, even the attacks from Bear Stearns, those are economic attacks that are being carried out upon our country by foreign powers. President Bush is related to Queen Elizabeth. He's related to the Habsburgs, which is Austria-Bavaria, Germany, and Italy. These very same old self-appointed royal families are carrying on the very same thing. And if you read this book I've mentioned, The Shield of Achilles, you'll see that the majority of our legal code has been given to us or forced upon us by Bismarck and Napoleon. And what they are trying to do now in a very Napoleonic or Bismarckian way is do the very same thing, change from behind the scenes through legal warfare as they're doing to me, change the constitutional order where people are presumed guilty rather than innocent, which is our constitutional order, and can be prosecuted, not in the judiciary, in the independent and impartial judiciary, but actually that the executive branch can now carry on trials and tribunals of individuals, and that the military law system is competing and is beginning to quickly overrun our civil court system. Again, I was in civil court. The Coast Guard pulled me out and pulled me into a military tribunal to step upon and quash those civil complaints. They've actually used those civil complaints as evidence against me. They have put out a be on the lookout warning or wanted poster saying that I may be dangerous. And as you can see in my testimony to you here today, the only thing that is dangerous about me is the information that I'm bringing to you to have you consider and ponder about what is going on here in the United States, and that this is about you as much as it is about me. There's case law. I've done a bunch of other videos. I asked you to get out and start to look into what the Coast Guard is up to and the use of military tribunals by the Coast Guard upon American civilians here in the United States. It must stop, and we need your help to do it. I ask you to go to the internet, learn about these things, and do what you can. Thank you. Peace.
Wow.